Michael always thought of his father as a shadow in his life, present but silent, always there but never fully close. Growing up in the small town of Ashland, Oregon, he remembered mornings filled with the sound of rain tapping against the roof, the creak of the old wooden porch, and the steady footsteps of his father leaving for work before sunrise. Richard was a man who carried responsibility like a soldier carried armor. He worked the land, paid the bills, and kept food on the table, but words of affection rarely escaped his lips. Michael used to watch his friends joke and laugh with their dads, sharing stories, playing ball in the yard, or simply sitting together in easy comfort. He envied that. His father was not unkind, but he lived behind a wall of silence. The most Michael usually got was a nod of approval when he brought home good grades or a short good job when a chore was done right. Love was there, Michael knew, but it was wrapped in silence so thick it sometimes felt invisible. As a boy, Michael tried to break through that silence. He would run to the porch when Richard came home, holding up a picture he drew or a small prize he won at school. Richard would look at it, smile faintly, and pat him on the shoulder before heading inside. It wasn't rejection, but it wasn't warmth either. Over time, Michael stopped showing his drawings, stopped rushing to the door. He learned to live with the quiet, telling himself that this was just how fathers were. But deep down, he wanted more. He wanted to hear stories about when his father was young, to know what dreams he once had, to feel like they were not just living under the same roof, but sharing the same life. Yet years passed, and the silence remained, settling between them like unspoken truth. By the time Michael reached high school, the distance between them had grown. He had his own friends, his own world, and Richard remained a figure in the background, steady, reliable, but unreachable. Michael often sat at the kitchen table, watching his father sip his black coffee, his eyes fixed on the newspaper as though the world inside those pages was easier to face than the sun sitting across from him. Sometimes Michael wanted to speak, to ask, "Dad, do you ever wonder what I'm feeling? Do you ever miss talking to me?" But the words stayed locked in his chest. And then, one evening, something shifted. It was a rainy Tuesday, the kind of day where the gray sky seemed to press down on the earth. Michael had just come home from school, his backpack slung carelessly over his shoulder, his shoes wet from puddles on the road. He was tired, worn out from a math test that hadn't gone well, his mind tangled with frustration. He expected the usual routine: drop his bag in his room, grab a snack, hear the quiet hum of the house. But instead, Richard's voice stopped him at the door. "Michael," his father said, his tone firm but not sharp. Michael froze. His name carried a weight he wasn't used to hearing. "Yes?" he answered cautiously. Richard set his coffee mug down and looked up. His eyes, usually hidden behind the shield of distance, met his son's directly. "Want to take a drive with me?" For a moment, Michael thought he misheard. His father never asked him to go anywhere unless it involved hauling lumber, picking up supplies, or fixing something around town. This sounded different, almost personal. He hesitated, his mind racing. Should he say yes? Would it just be awkward silence in the truck? But then curiosity sparked in him. Maybe this was the moment he had been waiting for. The moment when his father would finally open a door. "Sure," Michael replied, his voice steady though his heart beat faster. He followed his father to the old pickup truck parked in the driveway. The rain had eased into a soft drizzle, and the smell of wet earth filled the air. Michael climbed into the passenger seat, the worn leather cool against his hands. Richard started the engine, and the truck rumbled to life. Without another word, they pulled onto the road, heading away from the familiar streets of town and into the winding back roads that stretched toward the hills. Inside the truck, silence lingered, but it felt different than before. It wasn't the heavy, distant silence of their home. It was a silence filled with possibility, like something unspoken was waiting to be shared. Michael stole glances at his father, noticing things he hadn't before. The deep lines etched into his face, the steady way his hands gripped the wheel, the quiet strength that seemed both comforting and intimidating. The road curved past fields and tall pines, the truck's headlights reflecting on the damp pavement. Michael's mind swirled with questions. Why had his father asked him to come along? Was something wrong? Was there something Richard wanted to tell him? Every second that passed tightened the knot in his chest. He thought about all the years he had waited for this kind of moment. A simple drive, just the two of them, felt like a chance to bridge the gap, and yet Michael didn't know how to begin. Should he ask his father why they were driving? Should he wait for Richard to speak? The silence was fragile, like glass. One wrong word might shatter it. As they drove deeper into the hills, Michael noticed the faintest change in his father's posture. Richard wasn't his usual unshakable self. There was something softer, something uncertain, as if he too was searching for the right way to start. For the first time, Michael realized that maybe his father also struggled with silence. Maybe it wasn't distance, but fear. Fear of not knowing how to connect. The rain began to ease, and a pale light broke through the clouds, casting a silver glow across the valley. The truck continued on, carrying them both into an unknown moment. A moment that neither of them had expected, but both had needed. And in Michael's heart, hope flickered. Perhaps this drive would change everything. The hum of the old truck filled the silence as they drove farther from town. Michael leaned against the cool window, watching the blur of trees and rain-soaked fields slip past. The quiet pressed on him, heavy but not unbearable. It was a silence with edges, charged with something waiting to surface. His father's invitation still echoed in his mind. "Want to take a drive with me?" It was such a small question, yet it carried a weight Michael couldn't ignore. Richard kept his eyes fixed on the road, his face calm, but unreadable. He was always like that, a man carved out of stone, steady and unshaken. But today felt different. Michael sensed it in the way his father's jaw tightened, the way his hands gripped the wheel just a little harder than usual. Michael's mind swirled with possibilities. Maybe something had happened. Maybe his father was going to tell him about money problems, or about his grandfather's health, or something else serious. But there was also a part of him that hoped, just maybe, that this was about something deeper. For so long, he had wanted his father to open up, to let him in. Perhaps today was the day. The truck rolled through winding roads, the kind that curved around hills and opened suddenly to wide valleys. Patches of sunlight fought through the clouds, scattering gold across the wet ground. Richard finally cleared his throat, a sound so sudden that Michael almost jumped. "When I was your age," Richard said, his voice low, "I thought I had everything figured out." Michael's eyes snapped to him. His father never spoke about the past. It was like a sealed vault, and now, for the first time, the door was cracking open. Richard kept talking, his gaze locked on the road ahead. "I was restless. I wanted to leave this town. I thought if I could get away, I'd find something bigger, something better. But your grandfather needed me. The farm needed me, so I stayed." Michael sat straighter, his heartbeat quickening. He could hardly believe what he was hearing. This was the story he had been waiting for all his life. The story of who his father really was before responsibility hardened him. "I had a chance," Richard continued. "A scholarship, a way out. But I turned it down. I told myself it was the right thing to do. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't." His words trailed off, heavy with something unspoken. Michael swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Dad, do you ever regret it?" The question slipped out before he could stop it. For a long moment, the only sound was the truck's tires humming against the wet road. Richard didn't answer right away, and Michael wondered if he had crossed a line. His father had never been one to talk about feelings, but then Richard's lips pressed into a thin line, and he nodded slightly. "Sometimes," he admitted, "there are nights I lie awake and wonder what life might have been if I'd gone. Different places, different people, a whole different story." Michael felt his chest tighten. He had always thought of his father as unshakable, as someone who never doubted his choices. But hearing him speak like this, so honest, so vulnerable, made him see Richard in a new light. He wasn't just a father. He was a man, with dreams and sacrifices and scars Michael had never imagined. But then, Richard went on, his voice softening, "I see you. And I know my choice gave me something else, something I wouldn't trade for anything." He glanced at Michael then, just for a second, but in that glance, Michael saw more than years of silence had ever shown him. Love, pride, a connection that had always been there but hidden beneath layers of quiet. Michael turned his face toward the window, his eyes stinging. He didn't want his father to see the emotion welling up in him, all those years of distance, of unanswered questions, and now here was the truth. His father had stayed, had given up his own chance at freedom, not because he was trapped, but because of love. The truck slowed as they approached a fork in the road. Richard steered left, toward a stretch of road that climbed steadily upward. Michael recognized the route. It led to the overlook, a place people went to think or to watch the sun sink over the valley. He had never been there with his father before. The climb was steep, the road narrowing as pine trees crowded closer. Richard kept his eyes forward, his expression unreadable again, but the air between them had changed. The silence no longer felt like a wall. It was more like a pause, a space holding meaning too big for words. Michael's thoughts spun. He remembered all the times he had longed for this, longed for his father to open up, to share something real. And now, finally, it was happening. He wanted to ask 100 questions at once. What was the scholarship for? Where would you have gone? Who would you have been? But he held them back, afraid to push too hard. His father was finally opening the door, and Michael knew better than to slam it shut with impatience. Instead, he said quietly, "I never knew. You never told me." Richard's mouth curved into the faintest of smiles. "There's a lot I haven't told you. Maybe it's time I start." Those words landed heavy, a promise wrapped in simplicity. For years, Michael had wondered if his father even saw him beyond the surface. Now he realized his father had carried his own silence too, not out of lack of love, but out of not knowing how to share it. The truck reached the top of the hill, and the trees opened to reveal the overlook. The valley stretched wide below, the wet fields shimmering in the fading light. Richard parked the truck and shut off the engine. For a moment, neither of them moved. The world outside was vast, quiet and waiting. Michael glanced at his father, his heart pounding with something new. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was hope. The hope that this drive was more than just a conversation, more than just a rare story. It was the beginning of something he had waited for all his life. A bond not of chores and silence, but of honesty and connection. And as he sat there, watching the sky shift from gray to gold, Michael knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just another ordinary Tuesday. This was the day everything began to change. The truck rattled as it climbed higher into the hills, each turn narrowing the road and drawing them farther from the familiar streets of town. Michael sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap, stealing glances at his father. Richard's profile looked carved in stone, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed on the winding road. Yet Michael sensed something different in him, something unsettled. The silence pressed on Michael's chest. For years he had lived with his father's silence, but this time it wasn't empty. It felt alive, like the air before a storm, full of energy and weight. Michael wanted to break it, to say something, anything, but his words stuck in his throat. He didn't want to ruin what had just begun. His father had started sharing pieces of himself earlier, small cracks in the wall Michael thought would never fall. If he pushed too quickly, maybe the wall would close again. The road bent sharply, the valley spreading behind them. The sky had begun to shift, streaks of sunlight piercing through thinning clouds, painting the wet fields in gold. The air smelled of pine and rain, fresh and clean. Michael stared out the window, letting the beauty of the landscape calm his racing thoughts. Richard cleared his throat suddenly, his voice deep and steady. "I used to drive this way a lot when I was younger." Michael turned toward him, surprised. His father never mentioned his younger days. It was as if his life only began after responsibility took over. "Why?" Michael asked carefully. Richard's hands tightened on the wheel. "It helped me think. When the house was loud, when my head was louder, I'd drive out here, up to the overlook. It gave me space to breathe." He glanced at Michael, only for a second, then returned his eyes to the road. "I guess I thought maybe it could do the same for you." The words sank into Michael's chest, warm and heavy. His father hadn't just invited him on a random drive. He had brought him somewhere personal, a place that had mattered to him long ago. Michael's throat ached with emotion. For the first time, he felt like his father wasn't just a figure in his life, but a person letting him in. The truck reached a clearing where the trees parted, and Richard slowed down. The sound of the engine softened, leaving only the whisper of the wind outside. The valley stretched wide below them, shimmering under the fading light. Richard parked near the edge of the overlook, the tires crunching against gravel. The engine cut off, and silence wrapped around them like a blanket. Neither of them moved at first. Michael stared at the vastness before him, the green fields glistening from rain, the distant roofs of their town, the mountains rising beyond. It felt endless, humbling. He thought of his father coming here as a young man, wrestling with choices, sitting alone with dreams too big for their small town. The image shook him. Richard leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly. "I almost left from here once," he said quietly. "Drove all the way up here, sat in this spot and told myself I was going to keep driving until the road ran out." Michael turned to him, eyes wide. "What stopped you?" Richard's gaze lingered on the horizon. "Your grandfather. He was getting older. The farm was struggling. And I guess I was scared. Leaving meant starting over. And I wasn't sure I was strong enough." He paused, his voice lower now. "But the biggest reason was family. Walking away would have meant leaving them behind. And I couldn't do it." Michael felt his chest tighten. His father had given up his own dreams, his own freedom, to stay. And for the first time, Richard was admitting it out loud. The honesty was raw, unpolished, but it carried more weight than any lecture or advice ever could. Richard looked at his son then, his eyes softer than Michael had ever seen. "You're getting older now. Soon you'll have choices of your own, and I don't want you to make them out of fear. I don't want you lying awake wondering what might have been. You deserve better than that." Michael's breath caught. His father's words weren't just a story about the past. They were a gift, a piece of wisdom born from regret and sacrifice. He realized his father wasn't just opening up for the sake of talking. He was trying to hand him something precious, something that had taken him a lifetime to understand. The silence stretched again, but now it was different. It wasn't cold or distant. It was full, rich with everything that had been said, and everything still unspoken. Michael didn't need to fill it. He simply sat there, letting the truth of his father's words sink deep into him. A breeze rustled the pines around them. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Michael felt a strange calm settle over him, mixed with a quiet ache. For so long, he had wanted to hear his father's heart, to understand the man behind the silence. And now here it was, not perfect, not polished, but real. Finally, Michael found his voice. "Dad, thank you for telling me, for bringing me here." His words trembled, but they were steady enough to carry what he felt. Richard gave a small nod, his lips curving into the faintest smile. "I should have done it sooner, but I guess I didn't know how." Michael looked back at the valley, the colors deepening as the sun sank lower. His father's confession lingered in the air, wrapping itself around him like an invisible thread. For years, he had wondered if they would ever truly connect, if they would ever bridge the gap of silence. Now he felt it, fragile, new, but real. The truck remained still, the world outside vast and endless. Michael knew their bond wasn't suddenly fixed, that years of distance couldn't vanish in a single drive. But this was the beginning. The choice his father had made to share his truth, to bring him here, had opened a door that Michael never thought possible. And as he sat there, watching the horizon burn with fading light, Michael felt something he hadn't in years. A quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, he and his father were finally finding their way toward each other. The overlook was quiet except for the soft rustle of pine trees swaying in the wind. Michael leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on the wide valley below. The view stretched endlessly, but his thoughts were locked on the man sitting beside him. For years, Richard had been a mystery, steady but unreachable. Now, as the truck sat parked on the gravel road, that mystery was finally unraveling. Richard didn't rush. He simply stared at the horizon, his hands resting on the wheel as though he needed something solid to hold. The silence was long but not empty. It was waiting. Finally he spoke. When I was 17, Richard began, his voice low and steady. A letter came in the mail. It was from a university in California. They were offering me a scholarship, engineering, full ride. He let out a breath, the kind that carried years of memory. It felt like the world had opened up. I thought I could escape this town, make something of myself. Michael's eyes widened. He had never imagined his father as a boy with dreams of college, of building a different future. He tried to picture Richard at 17, full of energy and hope, ready to leave this quiet town behind. It was hard to imagine, yet suddenly, his father seemed more human, more real than ever before. I didn't tell many people, Richard continued. Just your grandmother and eventually your grandfather. I was ready to pack up and go, but your grandfather was sick that year. The farm was falling apart, and he needed me. His voice cracked on the last words. Richard tightened his grip on the steering wheel, as if steadying himself. Michael swallowed hard. He had always thought his father chose this life because it was what he wanted. To hear that it had been a sacrifice changed everything. What did you do? Michael asked softly, though he already knew the answer. Richard's eyes stayed on the horizon. I stayed. I turned down the scholarship. Told myself I'd reapply later when things settled, but the years kept moving, and responsibilities kept piling up. By the time I looked up, it was too late. Michael felt a lump rise in his throat. He could hear the weight in his father's words, the regret that had lived quietly in him for decades. He wondered how many nights Richard had sat awake, thinking about that letter, wondering what life might have been like. Do you regret it? Michael asked, his voice trembling. Richard paused for a long time. The question seemed to hang in the air, too heavy to answer quickly. Finally, he nodded. Sometimes, I won't lie to you. There are days I wonder who I might have become if I'd left. I wonder what kind of life I missed. He turned then, his eyes meeting Michael's. But then I think about the life I gained. Your mother. You. This land that's been in our family for generations. I regret the road not taken, but I don't regret the road I ended up on. Michael's chest ached. For so long he had believed his father's silence meant distance, even indifference. But now he saw it differently. His father's life wasn't built on apathy. It was built on sacrifice. The quiet man he had resented was someone who had given up his own dream for the sake of family. The thought both hurt and healed him. Hurt, because he saw the hidden sorrow in his father's eyes. Healed, because for the first time, he understood the love behind the silence. Richard exhaled slowly, his shoulders slumping. I tell you this, Michael, because I don't want you to make choices out of fear or guilt. Life gives you crossroads, and when it does, you have to choose the one you can live with, not the one that feels safest. His voice grew softer, almost a whisper. Don't carry regrets like I did. Promise me that. Michael blinked rapidly, fighting the sting of tears. He wasn't used to this side of his father. The vulnerability, the honesty. It was overwhelming, like finding treasure buried beneath years of dust. I promise, he whispered. Richard gave a small nod, as if the promise eased something inside him. For a moment, they both sat quietly, letting the valley and the fading sun hold them in its glow. Michael thought of all the years he had wanted this, all the nights he had wished his father would say something, anything, that showed he cared. And here it was, not flowery, not perfect but real. His father had given him the story of his life, not as a lecture, but as a gift. The sun slipped lower, painting the sky in orange and violet. Richard leaned back in his seat, his face calm now, as if a weight had lifted. You know, he said, I never brought anyone here before. Not even your mother. But I wanted you to see it. I wanted you to know where I almost made the biggest choice of my life. Michael's chest swelled. That meant something, more than words could capture. His father had chosen him to share this place, this memory, this piece of himself. It wasn't just a story. It was trust. For years, Michael had felt like a stranger in his own father's world. Now, sitting in that truck on the edge of the overlook, he realized that the distance had finally started to close. The wall of silence that had defined their relationship was cracking, not with grand gestures, but with honesty. The quiet stretched again, but this time it was peaceful. Michael looked at the horizon, then at his father, and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Closeness. "Dad," Michael said finally, his voice steady. I understand now. Thank you for staying, even if it wasn't easy." Richard's eyes softened, and for the first time, a real smile touched his lips. "You're welcome, son." The last rays of sunlight dipped below the mountains, and darkness began to settle. Michael knew their bond was not perfect, not fully healed, but something had changed tonight, something that would never be undone. His father's choice years ago had shaped their lives, and his choice to share that story had shaped their bond. As they sat there together, father and son, Michael realized the truth. Sometimes, it isn't the loud moments that change everything. It's the quiet ones, when a heart finally chooses to speak. The road back from the overlook was quiet, but the silence no longer felt heavy. Instead, it carried a new kind of weight, one filled with thought and unspoken emotion. Michael sat in the passenger seat, glancing at his father every few moments. Richard's profile was calm, almost peaceful, as though telling his story had finally lifted a burden he had carried for decades. Michael felt changed, too. For years, he had thought his father's quiet ways meant distance. Now he understood the silence had been made of sacrifice, not coldness. Every mile down that winding mountain road felt like they were traveling not just through the forest, but through years of misunderstandings and closing the gap between them. When they reached the edge of town, Richard slowed the truck and pulled into a small diner. The neon sign buzzed faintly, and the warm glow from inside spilled across the gravel lot. Richard turned to his son with a soft smile. "How about some coffee?" "We've got time." Michael nodded, surprised. His father wasn't the type to linger in town after work. This, too, felt like part of the change. They slid into a booth by the window, the smell of fresh pie and strong coffee filling the air. The waitress poured them both cups, and for a moment they simply sat there, the steam rising between them. Michael broke the silence. "I keep thinking about what you said, about choices. It makes me wonder, do you think I'm making the right ones?" His voice wavered. "Sometimes I feel like I'm just drifting." Richard looked at him steadily, the kind of look that searched deeper than words. "Drifting isn't always a mistake. Sometimes it's how you figure out where the current is taking you. The only real mistake is standing still because you're afraid." He leaned forward slightly. "Michael, you're not me. You don't have to carry my regrets. You get to write your own story." Michael felt his throat tighten. The words were simple, but they pierced straight through the fog of doubt that had haunted him. For years he had feared disappointing his father, worried that his own choices wouldn't measure up. Hearing this lifted a weight he hadn't even realized he carried. Richard sipped his coffee, then added softly, "But whatever you do, don't shut people out the way I did. It cost me more than I like to admit." His eyes softened, and Michael realized his father wasn't just talking about lost dreams. He was talking about all the moments of connection he had let slip away. Michael reached across the table, resting his hand briefly on his father's. It was a gesture he had never dared before. "I don't want distance between us anymore," he said quietly. "I don't care if we don't always understand each other. I just want us to try." Richard's eyes glistened. He didn't pull away. Instead, he gave a small nod. "Then we try. Starting now." The words seemed to echo in Michael's chest. Something inside him shifted. It wasn't a perfect fix, but it was real. They sat for a while longer, talking about small things. Old neighbors, funny memories, even favorite baseball games from years past. Each word built a bridge, plank by plank, across the space that had once divided them. When they finally left the diner, the night air was cool, the stars sharp against the dark sky. They stood by the truck for a moment, neither in a rush to end the night. Richard looked up, his voice calm but firm. "Michael, one day you'll stand at your own crossroads. When you do, don't think about me. Don't think about what I might have wanted. Think about what makes you feel alive. That's the choice you can live with." Michael nodded, the words sinking deep into him. It wasn't advice he would forget. It was the kind that would follow him, guiding him through every decision ahead. They drove home, the headlights cutting through the dark country roads. By the time they pulled into the driveway, Michael felt as though something inside him had been rebuilt. The silence that once hung like a wall between them was gone, replaced by something steady and warm. As Richard parked the truck, he turned to his son one last time. "You know," he said, his voice soft, "I used to think staying here meant losing everything. But tonight I realized something. If I hadn't stayed, I wouldn't be sitting here with you. And I wouldn't trade that for anything." Michael's eyes stung. He wanted to respond, but words felt too small. Instead, he nodded, holding on to the moment with everything in him. They walked inside, the house quiet around them. Before heading to bed, Michael paused at the bottom of the stairs. "Dad?" he called softly. Richard turned. "Thanks. For telling me. For everything." Richard's face broke into a rare, gentle smile. "Good night, son." That night, as Michael lay awake, he thought of all the ways one choice could shape a life. His father had given up his dream for family, and though it had left him with regrets, it had also created bonds that could not be broken. And now, by sharing that truth, he had given Michael the freedom to chase his own path without fear. Michael closed his eyes with a new kind of peace. For the first time, he didn't feel alone in his struggle. He felt connected, to his father, to his family, to the story that had shaped them both. And he knew that whatever choices lay ahead, he would carry this night with him forever. The bond between father and son wasn't built in loud moments or perfect words. It was built here, in sacrifice, in honesty, in the quiet promise that they would no longer live behind walls of silence. And as the house settled into sleep, one truth lingered like a steady light. Sometimes, the most powerful choice isn't the one you make for yourself, but the one you make for the ones you love. The end.